It's Remu, slowly. It's Marissa, slowly. Hey, Marissa, I heard that relations between South Korea and the US have been shaken up again recently. Is that true? Yes, that's right. The truth is that the US has issued an outrageous ultimatum to South Korea. What is it? It's a choice between accepting the agreement and following the rules like a civilian, or continuing to pay a high 25% tax and letting the economy collapse. What? It's not even a threat. It's not even a matter of diplomacy. That's right. And this isn't just a rumor. The US Secretary of State spoke frankly in a TV interview. This is a serious message for South Korea that's no laughing matter. But why did they say such harsh things? It involves the investment agreement that South Korea tried to negotiate with the US, the behind-the-scenes talks at the summit level, and even the illegal labor scandal. In other words, this story isn't just about economic figures. It's also about society, diplomacy, and international relations. Wow, just listening to it makes me feel like things are going to get chaotic. So this time, I'm going to explain in detail the behind the scenes of the US economy and the true nature of the situation. Take your time. First, let's start with the news. On September 11, 2025, Secretary of State Lutnick appeared in an interview broadcast on CNBC in the United States. What came out of his mouth was a death sentence for South Korea. Did he say something so terrible? Yes, this is what Secretary Lutnick said. When the South Korean president visited the White House, he did not sign the agreement related to the so-called Japan-US Commerce and Industry Agreement. Japan had completed all the necessary paperwork, but South Korea did not. A handshake and a signature are two different things. In other words, South Korea was criticized for not properly signing the agreement that it had promised to the United States. That's right. And the final blow was the phrase, "The devil is in the details." This means that even if you try to get away with just verbal promises, everything will be recorded in the actual contract. South Korea staged a formal agreement, but from the US's perspective, it was just avoiding the crucial signing. So that's why they gave us an ultimatum? Yes. Secretary Lutnick asserted that South Koreans have no choice but to accept the agreement or pay the 25% tariff. Either way, South Korea faces a tough choice. What this statement has revealed is the fact that the US is taking a tough stance towards South Korea. Behind this lies South Korea's investment plans and domestic vulnerabilities. The problem is the $350 billion investment that South Korea promised to the US. If you hear this, you might think that South Korea is doing its best, but the reality is that the conditions are outrageous. What? $350 billion is a huge amount of money. The problem is that all of these investment projects are selected by the US. In other words, South Korea cannot decide which areas to invest in. And while South Korea provides the funds, the US takes 90% of the profits. Only 10% remains in South Korea. Wait, isn't that more like an investment than almost anything? That's right. Furthermore, South Korea bears all the risks. If the project fails, South Korea will bear 100% of the losses. If it succeeds, the US will make most of the profits. If it fails, South Korea will bear the entire cost. This is like a permanent payment system. Are such one-sided conditions okay? Even within South Korea, voices are being raised that this is being treated as a form of occupation. There is opposition from both the ruling and opposition parties and the business community, but America's demands remain unchanged. If they do not promise to invest, they will be subject to a 25% tariff. Whichever option they choose, it will be hell for South Korea. It seems like there are options, but in reality there is no escape. That's how it is. A strong sense of crisis is spreading in South Korean society as these unequal conditions have come to light. But that's not the only problem. The next thing to watch is the US summit held in August 2025. Normally, when the leaders of allied countries meet, they would be treated equally, but this time the treatment was quite humiliating for South Korea. That's what was humiliating about it. First of all, it's the White House. Previous South Korean presidents have always stayed at Blair House, a museum next to the White House. But this time, that wasn't provided and they were made to stay at a regular hotel. I see. It's painful that such a symbolic aspect is being overlooked. Furthermore, the airport reception was also downgraded. Normally, the head of the assembly would have greeted them, but this time it was the representative who greeted them. It may seem like a small thing, but it is an important element to show nuclear power in a diplomatic setting. The South Korean side had no choice but to accept that they were completely disregarded. So was the nickname discussed at the crucial meeting? That was the problem again, and the nickname issue was not mentioned at all. The reason given was that it was not worth discussing as long as the agreement had not been signed. Even if you shake hands, you will not be taken seriously unless you have signed with God. It is exactly like a ghost town. Oh dear. So does that mean the South Korean side achieved nothing? That is exactly right. Furthermore, there was hardly any mention of ghost stories about South Korea on Trump's SNS. In past meetings, there was always some kind of message, but this time it was ignored. This was also a major humiliation for South Korea. When you put it all together like this, it seems that even trust as an ally is being questioned. That may be true. It seems that the impact of South Korea not signing the agreement is being felt in serious ways, not only in the economy but also in diplomacy. Furthermore, the large-scale accident at the LNG battery plant in Georgia, USA, had a major impact on South Korean society. On September 4, 2025, the Immigration and Customs Administration, ICE, launched a massive operation at this factory, detaining a whopping 475 people. Wait, why were there Koreans among them? It has been reported that more than 300 of those detained were illegal Korean workers. Furthermore, the incident was made public on video, and footage of them being handcuffed and taken away was broadcast around the world. It was an extremely humiliating scene for South Korea. I see. It must have tarnished the image of South Korea for South Koreans. That's right. The South Korean media also reacted in unison. The Korea Economic Daily said it was a betrayal of trust in an ally. The Jungang Ilbo said it shook the value and trust of the government-US alliance. It felt like a stab in the back. The Seoul Economic Daily in particular succinctly expressed the feelings of the people by saying that South Korean workers were treated like war soldiers. War soldiers, that's a strong word to use. That must mean the shock was that big. This incident was not just a labor issue, but also greatly worsened South Korean people's feelings toward the United States. Angry voices flooded South Korean social media and comment sections, asking if this was the right way to form an alliance. As a result, suspicion and a sense of humiliation toward the United States permeated society as a whole. It was a double whammy for South Korea, as it was diplomatically detained and then arrested. Moreover, this also triggered subsequent stagnation in investment and economic turmoil. In other words, the US-China incident left deep scars on South Korean society, both economically and psychologically. And South Korea's predicament is not just a domestic issue. Overseas media and think tanks are also calmly analyzing it. Major American news organizations have been reporting one after another on how South Korea is struggling in negotiations with the United States. What were they specifically? First, CNN. They published an article titled, "South Korea Learned a Deep Lesson from Dealing with Trump." This symbolically represents the current situation in which South Korea is being swayed by the Trump administration's America First policy. In other words, it is a cold-hearted ally that will not get its way even if it cozies up to the United States. Yes, for South Korea, it is a blunt assessment of the United States. Furthermore, the New York Times has made some harsh remarks. It was reported that anger over U.S. trade policy is creating backlash in South Korea and Japan. The report covered the situation where South Korean business associations are starting to suspend large-scale investments in the U.S. In other words, South Korean companies are losing trust in the US market. I see. It's serious that they are actually moving to stop investing. And the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a think tank, analyzed that South Korea's industrial diplomacy strategy is in direct conflict with US domestic politics. South Korea has distanced itself from China and moved closer to the US, but it has hardly received the returns it expected. Instead, it has been unilaterally imposed harsh conditions. It's disappointing that South Korea has cut ties with China and become more sympathetic to the US. Even from an overseas perspective, South Korea's diplomacy is backfiring. The days when South Korea would be safe if it just cozied up to the US are over, and it is now being seen as being used. Amidst the harsh analysis from overseas, serious situations are spreading on the ground. Of these, the one that has had the biggest impact is the wave of investment triggered by the incidents at Hyundai and LG's US factories, which I explained earlier. Is that affecting all of South Korean companies' operations in the US? Yes, it is. After the incident, LG Energy Solutions temporarily suspended construction for batteries. Furthermore, work on 22 factory construction projects that South Korean companies were working on was suspended one after another. The affected industries are all major South Korean industries, including automobiles, wire building, steel, and electrical equipment. If major industries suddenly come to a halt, it would be a huge blow to the South Korean economy. That's exactly right. They were counting on expansion in the US, but visa issues and unclear differences in contract terms have prevented them from moving forward. Furthermore, there is a growing possibility that the American Shipbuilding Great Again agreement reached by President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung in August 2025 will also be cancelled. If shipbuilding also comes to a halt, South Korea's main source of income will completely collapse. South Korean business owners are crying out that their businesses cannot be sustained under these conditions. The pillars of their industry are crumbling, and there is no prospect of recovery. This is the chain of damage to the South Korean economy. There is great ambiguity within the South Korean government over this agreement. The Chosun Ilbo reported that the government's policy chief said it would be difficult to sign under the current conditions. While outwardly they appear to be cooperative, there seems to be strong resistance. That's right. In a KBS report, a government official said, "We can't protect our national interests in this format." However, if they were to refuse publicly, it would have a serious impact on relations with the United States. The South Korean government is in a difficult situation where they can't just drink and refuse. It's tough. Meanwhile, Japan has already concluded negotiations and completed the paperwork, and Secretary of State Lutnick emphasized that Japan has completed the procedures. As a result, Japan is in an advantageous position in terms of terms as well. Why was Japan able to proceed so well, even though they are both allies of the United States? The big difference lies in the content presented. Japan presented specific investment projects such as the construction of nuclear power plants, the development of pipelines in Alaska, and the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. They were able to solidify the foundation for negotiations by showing areas that were essential to the United States. The difference was so great because it was not just about the numbers, but also about whether or not they made the type of investment clear. That's right. South Korea had a large budget but lacked a plan to back it up. As a result, the US took the lead. The South Korean government's struggles show that its weaknesses are directly linked to foreign negotiations. Now, let's look at the nature of the South Korean economy itself. Its biggest feature is its heavy dependence on foreign countries. With a limited domestic market, it is inevitably dependent on exports. In other words, because it has no choice but to rely on foreign countries, it is easily affected by movements overseas. That's right. If even the slightest friction occurs in a major export destination country, the impact will be felt directly across the entire economy. The recent tensions with the US have also highlighted South Korea's weaknesses. What other weaknesses are there? The biggest one is the lack of a technological foundation. South Korea's main industries are automobiles and machinery, but many of them rely on cutting-edge American technology and Japanese parts. Because it lacks its own basic technology, it runs the risk of production halting immediately if regulations or supply restrictions are imposed. South Korea has never developed its own technology domestically, so it is now starting to bear heavily on it. Furthermore, there is noticeable lag in research and development and the development of small and medium-sized enterprises. The industrial structure is centered on large corporations, so there is little room to take on new challenges. As a result, it has become difficult to respond to changes in the overseas environment. It is a double weakness, relying on the outside but not developing internal strength, dependence on foreign powers, lack of technology, and an immature industrial base. The combination of these has made the Korean economy unstable and susceptible to even the slightest external pressure. This is what is behind the current crisis. As we have seen so far, Korea is currently facing an economic crisis. And there are three main options. 3. What options are left? The first is to accept America's conditions. If they accept the harsh conditions as they are, they will have to surrender most of their profits and will effectively be in a subordinate position. In other words, they will be accepting treatment like a private landowner. That would be tantamount to losing their independence as a country. The second option is to not sign the agreement and continue to pay the full tax burden. But in that case, the industry will be exhausted by the 25% tariff and the economy will risk shrinking rapidly. There are high costs even if they do not comply. The third option is to repair relations with China and return. However, this would likely worsen relations with the US and risk losing its standing in the international community. Whichever path it chooses, it will face a bleak future. That's right, South Korea's strategy of balancing the economy with China and security with the US, which it had been trying to achieve up until now, has collapsed. As a result, all three options left have the potential to significantly damage the country's future. So it really is a maze with no way out. Yes. This series of events can be said to be the result of the structural weaknesses that South Korea has built up, and no matter which path it chooses, there is no future in which it can live without paying a price. That is the reality. September 10, 2025. Multiple Russian long-range attack drones entered Polish airspace, one of which crashed into a house in the area, partially destroying the building. When I saw this news, I thought that Russia had finally begun to attack Poland, which I had been wary of for a long time. I even thought that the world had finally pulled the trigger. In response to this situation, the Polish government reported the situation to other countries, and an emergency meeting is currently being held at the Polish leadership. According to an announcement by the Polish Ministry of Defense, the remains of a drone from the 16th batch have been recovered. There is also information that the drone that inspected the airspace was from the 23rd batch, and that the remains of a missile from the first batch have been discovered. So they have been inspecting the airspace constantly in the dark of night. Even so, 16 drones, even just the ones that were intercepted, seems like quite a number. If that many drones had come, wouldn't there have been a lot of confusion in Poland? Oh, and apparently 4 airports in Poland, including Osakusa, were taken out of service. In response to this situation, Poland invoked Article 4 of the treaty, and an emergency consultation meeting was held at the request of the affected country. Article 4 of the treaty adopts the principle that an attack on one country is an attack on all countries. Article 4 of the treaty stipulates that member states are the main decision-making body of the treaty. They can formally submit the issue to the Council of State, which consults with their allies and discusses future responses. The question at the time was that consultations would be held whenever any of the imperial treaty powers judges that the territorial integrity, political independence or security of any of the imperial treaty powers is threatened. So they immediately put that into action. But from this content, it seems to me that there is a strong nuance that they are discussing whether or not it is an attack on NATO. That's sharp. Regarding the basis of the NATO Treaty, which states that an attack on one of the Allied powers is considered an attack on all of the Allied powers, the content stipulated above states that an armed attack on one of the Allied powers is considered an act of violence against all of the Allied powers, and prompts prompt support for the Allied power in question. So the idea is that this is a provision to deal with the stages preceding Articles 4 and 5. If that's the case, doesn't the fact that consultations are being held under Article 4 mean that NATO may be in the stages preceding a counterattack on Russia? That's one way of thinking about it. According to the NATO party, the competition based on Article 4 could lead to some form of joint decision or action on behalf of the Allied powers. All decisions by allies are made by consensus, so this competitive process is extremely important. It's easy to see that the possibility of entering the Ukrainian war is becoming a reality. If that were to happen, the war could spread all over the world and a real global competition could begin. That's exactly right. Russian-made long-range drones are believed to have entered Polish airspace, with some even penetrating Polish territory for tens or even more than 100 kilometers. Polish F-16 fighter jets, Dutch F-35 fighter jets, and Italian A-35 early warning aircraft were jointly deployed to carry out an operation to shoot down the Russian-made drones. I understand that it's a critical situation with Russian-made drones entering deep into Polish territory due to tensions, but I feel that deploying F-16s and F-35s is going too far, or rather, it's too much to deploy fighter jets that are not effective for the purpose of intercepting drones. I think it's natural to have that impression, considering the Ukrainian drone interceptions so far. In fact, Poland's Jarosław Groman Nakagami, in a media interview, likened this joint operation to using a cannon to catch flies. It has been analyzed that the reason for deploying such effective, state-of-the-art fighter jets to cheaply intercept drones is because Poland has a unique defense against low-altitude drones. Does that mean that Poland does not yet have the necessary airspace to intercept drones? That's right. Groman Nakagami analyzed this operation as a hybrid operation by Russia that combined long-range drone attacks with media activities. He believes that it was an attempt by Russia to test Poland's response capabilities and reaction speed. Regarding the media activities, the drones were 97 kilometers away from Asha during the attack. It seems that false information was spread that they had reached Jahanau, so they have been using the new tactics they learned in the war in Ukraine as preparatory work for an attack on Poland. As a result, it has been revealed that Poland's response capabilities against drones are still immature. Isn't this playing out exactly as Russia intended, and quite problematic? That's why Poland moved quickly to respond. On September 11, 2025, it was reported that the Polish military sent personnel to Ukraine to receive drone shoot-down training from the Ukrainian military. The purpose of the mission was to receive practical guidance on how to deal with the Ukrainian military, which has been under constant attack by Russian drones. That's what happened. In addition, following the Polish airspace raid, Germany announced that it would step up support for its eastern border. The Netherlands has reportedly committed to deploying 300 troops and has brought forward the deployment of 2 of the 3 Patriot anti-aircraft missiles promised to Poland. Furthermore, the Czech Republic has reportedly informed Poland that it will deploy 3 helicopters and 100 troops. Aid from the EU is accelerating. By the way, has Russia made a statement on this matter? The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced that there were no plans to attack targets within Poland. On the day of this incident, Russia was conducting a large-scale drone attack on Ukraine. They claimed that some of the drones involved in the raid ended up in Ukraine's airspace. The basis for this claim is that Russian-made drones cannot fly more than 700 kilometers. No. They accidentally invaded Poland, the country that Russia is supposed to be most wary of. That would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Oh, and this excuse sounds like a plausible excuse, but there is a lot of evidence that suggests otherwise. In the first place, it is known that drones were also coming from Belarus in the drone attack on Ukraine, so it is logical to say that basing it on the flight distance is illogical. They were just suddenly attacked. In addition, if you check the records of drones tracking Ukraine and aircraft flight records using flight radar, you can confirm that some drones were headed for Poland so blatantly that it cannot be dismissed as a coincidence. On the other hand, there seems to be a claim spreading among the new Russians that the drones accidentally entered Poland due to electronic beam jamming. This is also a plausible claim, but I wonder what the trial will be like. Electronic beams cannot change the drone's course, and even if they can only block communications. If communications are interrupted in the middle, they will simply fly along the programmed route. In this case, multiple drones were simultaneously and spontaneously circling towards Poland, so it is highly likely that the course was programmed in advance. He is saying that even if they make a plausible claim, anyone who sees it will immediately see that it is a lie. If it becomes less likely that the air raid was a mistake, the security measures in Poland will likely be tightened. Oh, and the Polish territorial defense forces have been upgraded to a higher level of security than usual, and it is believed that they have moved to the most immediate security measures since the Nazis. I get the impression that tensions are rising considerably. In this situation, the stance of the United States, which is mediating between the two countries, is a concern, but what is happening? In the United States, there have been a series of critical reactions to Russia from both sides. On the other hand, President Trump's reaction seems to be weak. It seems that he ignored questions from reporters about the air raid on Poland and got into his car and drove away. He is said to have suggested at the White House afterwards that it was possible that the incident was a mistake by Russia. As usual, there is no escape. It no longer feels like Russia is acting with this attitude in mind. It is true that such analyses are emerging. President Trump has been seeking to improve relations with Russia in recent months, and has been conducting telephone diplomacy with President Putin. Also, at the summit in Alaska, not only did they not put any pressure on Russia, they responded by setting up a red traffic jam. It is thought that Russia interpreted these actions as the US doing to Russia, and decided that even more extreme actions would be acceptable, which is why they took action to directly provoke the Republican Party this time. President Trump's diplomacy may have strengthened President Putin and become a global force. Interestingly, Vice President Vance mentioned that regardless of whether he likes Russia or not, Russia has a lot of resources, and he is said to have made comments that support President Trump's idea that if the war comes to an end, the US could conclude a very productive economic agreement. This guy continues to say strange things. The fact that he is talking about making money when the empire may be receiving favors from Russia really shows that he thinks the war in Ukraine is something that has nothing to do with them. This comment gives us a glimpse into the White House's true intentions. But I think the idea that the US should not get involved in the war is completely off the mark. Although it has the world's largest military, the United States may need to think a little more seriously about the fact that China and Russia are in a close relationship, and that it won't get away with it. When you think about it that way, you start to worry that Japan could be dragged into war at any time if things continue as they are. There's also the issue of North Korean territory with Russia, and the airspace dispute has been ongoing for a long time. That's true. In an interview, President Putin's advisor Patrushev, who is said to be the fastest-growing politician, claimed that Japan doesn't need justice, it just needs resources regarding the North Korean territory issue. He also made critical remarks about Japan during the parade to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, and his statement that Japan's attempt to return to its former militarism is cause for concern has become a hot topic. It's also scary that ties between China and North Korea have strengthened. North Korea has repeatedly launched ballistic missiles toward Japan, and they say that a popular movie about Japan is a big hit in China. If Japan continues to be careless, it could end up being surrounded by a moat and drawn into war. Looking at the current state of the world, it's scary to think that this is entirely possible. It may be time for Japan to seriously consider time defense and security. We'll have to keep a close eye on how the world moves forward. That's all for the explanation. Was it easy to understand? If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching. Please come back again soon.